Welcome to The Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we're going to explore the story of Halloween, a night that has somehow survived bonfires, bishops, and candy companies to become the festival we know today. The story begins in darkness, not the comfortable darkness of a switched-off lamp, but the profound, absolute darkness that settled over northern Europe when the sun began its retreat toward winter. Long before calendars carved the year into neat squares, before clocks parcelled out the hours, human beings marked time by what they could see dying around them. Picture, if you will, the landscape of prehistoric Europe as autumn deepened into that uncertain space before winter's grip. The forests stood stripped of their glory, branches reaching skyward like the skeletal fingers of giants buried just beneath the soil. The fields lay harvested, reduced to stubble that crunched beneath foot like the remnants of some vast feast now concluded. The air itself seemed to thin, to withdraw its warmth in preparation for the trials ahead. And the people who inhabited this landscape understood, with a clarity that our centrally heated minds struggled to comprehend, that they stood at the edge of an abyss. Winter, you see, was not merely a season. It was a test of worthiness, a months-long examination that many would fail. The harvest, now locked in root cellars and storage pits, represented the difference between survival and starvation. The cattle slaughtered and salted at autumn's end would need to sustain entire communities through the barren months. Every sunset arrived a little earlier, every sunrise came a little later, and the darkness between them grew like a living thing, patient and hungry. So they built fires. Not the modest campfires of summer evenings, but towering bonfires that challenged the encroaching night, that sent sparks spiraling upward as if to remind the retreating sun where it belonged. They gathered around these flames as darkness fell, entire villages circling the light, and they told themselves stories about why they did this. They said it was to honor the spirits, to mark sacred transitions, to celebrate the turning of the great wheel of the year, and perhaps it was. But it was also, let us be honest about this, because fire kept the wolves away, because light held back the shadows where anything might wait, because flame was warmth, and warmth was life, and life was everything they had to bargain with. The people of this ancient world were not fools. They understood patterns, cycles, the reliable return of seasons, but they also understood that understanding something does not grant you power over it. They knew winter would come, just as they knew some of them would not see spring. And so they developed rituals, ceremonies, observances, elaborate structures of meaning built around the simple, terrible fact that darkness always returns. They began to notice things at this threshold time, this boundary between the year of light and the year of darkness. The fog lay thicker in the mornings, clinging to the ground, as if reluctant to release its hold. Animals behaved strangely, gathering in unusual numbers or falling silent when they should be calling. The very air seemed charged with something. Not quite electricity, which they had no name for, but a presence, a thickness, as if the world itself held its breath. And in this charged atmosphere, this liminal space between seasons, they convinced themselves that other boundaries grew thin as well. The boundary between life and death, for instance, that seemed negotiable at this time of year, permeable, like a door left slightly ajar. The recently departed might find their way back for a visit. The long dead might stir in their barrows and take an interest in the affairs of the living. The spirits of the land itself, whatever gods or forces animated the trees, the streams, the stones, might press closer to the human world, curious or hungry, or simply present in ways they were not during the safer seasons. This was not necessarily cause for celebration. The modern mind, cushioned by electric lights and deadbolt locks, tends to romanticize communion with the supernatural. The ancient mind knew better. The dead were to be respected, certainly. Honored, absolutely. But invited casually into your home. That required precautions. Still, fear and reverence have always maintained a complicated relationship in the human heart. These ancient Europeans, shivering in the firelight, developed an entire vocabulary of gestures meant to navigate the supernatural presence they believed surrounded them. They left offerings at the boundaries of their settlements, food for the wandering dead, presumably on the theory that a well-fed ghost is a less troublesome ghost. They carved faces into vegetables and root crops, creating masks that might fool malevolent spirits into believing they were not human at all, but fellow supernatural entities, best left alone. They wore costumes, these ancient people, not for amusement, but for survival. They disguised themselves as animals, as spirits, as anything other than vulnerable human beings caught between the harvest and the frost. And they moved through the darkness in groups, never alone, always together, because isolation at this time of year was a particular kind of madness. The bonfires burned through the night, and around them humanity engaged in what might charitably be called protective theatre, an elaborate performance designed to convince themselves and whatever might be watching from the shadows that they were in control, that they understood the rules, that they knew how to survive this threshold time. Because that, ultimately, is what these ancient observances represented. Not ignorance or superstition, though they contained elements of both, but a profound engagement with fear, a refusal to simply cower in the dark, an insistence on meeting the terror of the season with fire, with ritual, with the human capacity to make meaning from dread. They pretended it was about honoring the spirits, these early Europeans. They performed elaborate ceremonies and spoke of sacred duty. But underneath all the ritual language and careful gestures, a simpler truth persisted. They were afraid of the dark, and the fire kept it back for one more night. And really, if we are being honest with ourselves, that has not changed as much as we like to believe. The smoke from those ancient fires drifts through millennia, carrying with it the smell of fear and defiance, of reverence and pragmatism, of humanity standing at the edge of darkness and refusing to go quietly. It carries all the way to a specific people, in a specific place, who would take these scattered impulses and forge them into something resembling a coherent festival. The Celts did not invent the fear of winter's approach, nor the fires built against it, but they gave it a name, a structure, and a sacred calendar. They called it Samhain. The Celtic world stretched across much of ancient Europe like a tapestry woven from mist and memory. From the Atlantic coasts of Ireland to the forests of Central Europe, from the highlands of Scotland to the valleys of Gaul, the Celtic peoples shared languages, customs, and a particular way of understanding time that would prove remarkably persistent. They did not measure the year as we do, beginning in the dead of winter, for reasons that now seem largely bureaucratic. The Celtic year turned on more practical hinges, the cycles of pastoral life, the rhythms of herding and harvest, the observable patterns of the natural world. And in their understanding, the year did not begin with the first day of spring or the summer solstice, but with the death of summer itself. Samhain, pronounced for those attempting it for the first time, somewhere between Samhain and Shwin, with all the clarity of Gaelic pronunciation, marked the Celtic New Year. It fell at the threshold between October and November, when the last harvest had been gathered, when the cattle had been brought down from summer pastures, when the agricultural year concluded and the dark half began. The logic was impeccable, really. Why pretend that new beginnings arrive with spring flowers when everyone knows that true change begins with death? The old year had to end, properly and completely, before anything new could begin. And Samhain was that ending, the moment when summer's last breath expired and winter's first inhalation began. The festival stretched across 3 days and nights, though the most significant observances occurred at sunset on what we would call October 31st. Because the Celts, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that days began at dusk rather than dawn. The logic here, too, held its own internal consistency. Darkness precedes light. Death precedes rebirth. The seed must be buried before it can grow. The day began in darkness because that was the natural order of things. As the sun descended on the eve of Samhain, the Druids, the priestly class who served as everything from judges to physicians to astronomers, began their preparations. These were not the white-robed, mistletoe-gathering figures of Victorian imagination, but practical men and women who understood that managing a community's relationship with the sacred was serious business. They had spent the year observing, calculating, maintaining the complex calendar that governed agricultural and religious life. And now, at the year's most dangerous threshold, their expertise was required. The fires were extinguished, every hearth in the village, every flame that had burned through the year was deliberately put out. The darkness that resulted must have been profound, total, absolute, uncompromised by street lamps or distant windows. Just the natural darkness that our ancestors knew intimately, and we have nearly forgotten. And then, in that darkness, a new fire was born. The Druids kindled it using specific woods, sacred techniques, words of power that had been passed down through generations of training. This was not merely a practical matter of producing flame, though it was certainly that. This was the creation of sacred fire, blessed fire, fire that would protect and sustain the community through the dark half of the year. The bonfire was built on a hilltop when possible, visible for miles, a declaration of intent against the encroaching darkness. From this sacred fire, every household would take flame to relight their own hearths, the fire that would cook their meals, warm their homes, hold back the winter darkness, all of it derived from this moment, this ritual, this communal assertion that life persisted even at the year's death. But Samhain was not merely a fire festival, not simply an elaborate method of synchronized pyromania. It was the night when the veil between worlds grew thin. That metaphor, the veil, has been used so often it has nearly lost its meaning, become a cliché of supernatural fiction. But to the Celts, this was not metaphor. This was observable reality, as real as the thinning daylight or the falling temperature. The boundary between the living and the dead, they believed, became permeable at Samhain. Not destroyed, not removed, merely thinned, like fabric worn through with age. The spirits of the dead could cross back into the world of the living. They could visit the homes they once inhabited, sit beside the fires they once tended, walk among those they had loved. This belief required a response, and the Celts developed an elaborate protocol for supernatural hospitality. Places were set at the table for the dead. Food was prepared and offered, left on doorsteps or at crossroads where the spirits might find it. The door was left unbarred, not wide open, which would be reckless, but unlocked, accessible to those who knew the way. There was a touching optimism in these gestures, a hope that the dead would return home like travelers from a long journey. Tired, perhaps, but essentially unchanged. That they would eat the food prepared for them, warm themselves at the fire, and offer their blessings to the living they left behind. That they would be, in essence, temporary guests rather than permanent residents. Of course, not all spirits were beloved ancestors returning for a friendly visit. The other world, the Celtic conception of the realm beyond death, contained multitudes. There were the Aios Sea, the fairy folk, who were not at all the delicate, butterfly-winged creatures of later imagination, but powerful, dangerous beings who might help or harm as the mood struck them. There were nature spirits, elementals bound to specific places, who became more active and less predictable when the boundaries thinned. There were the truly malevolent dead, those who had died badly or carried grudges beyond the grave, who might use this night to settle scores or cause mischief. So, alongside the welcome fires and prepared meals, the Celts employed defensive measures. They carved turnips, large, pale, remarkably unpleasant turnips, into faces, creating lanterns that served both practical and protective purposes. The light guided friendly spirits home, while the grotesque faces deterred those with less wholesome intentions. They wore disguises, animal skins, and crude masks, transforming themselves into creatures that might be overlooked by dangerous spirits or mistaken for fellow supernatural beings. The Druids performed divination on this night, reading the future in the patterns of smoke, the fall of stones, the behavior of sacred animals. Because if the veil was thin enough for the dead to cross, it was thin enough to glimpse what lay ahead. Young people sought visions of their future spouses, a tradition that would persist in increasingly frivolous forms for thousands of years. Leaders consulted the Druids about the coming year, about war and peace, about the prosperity or failure of crops not yet planted. Games were played, though games, perhaps, gives the wrong impression. These were ritual activities with serious purposes, structured ways of engaging with the supernatural forces believed to be present. There was divination through apple peeling, through nuts roasted in the fire, through the shapes of shadows cast by the bonfire. There were races and contests that mimicked the struggle between summer and winter, life and death, order and chaos. And through it all, the community gathered. That, perhaps, was the deepest purpose of Samhain, not the individual rituals or specific beliefs, but the gathering itself. At the moment when winter threatened to isolate every household in its own struggle for survival, Samhain pulled people together. It reminded them that they were not alone, that they faced the darkness as a community, that the fire they shared was stronger than the shadows that surrounded them. The Druids understood this, consciously or not. Their elaborate ceremonies, their sacred fires, their management of the supernatural, all of it reinforced social bonds at precisely the moment when those bonds would be most tested. The family that received fire from the communal bonfire carried home more than flame. They carried connection, obligation, the reminder that they were part of something larger than their own survival. As dawn arrived on November 1st, the Celtic New Year properly began. The intensity of Samhain's supernatural opening ebbed. The dead returned to their realm. The spirits withdrew. The veil thickened once more. Life continued, but transformed. The old year was truly ended. The new year had begun, and the community had passed through the threshold together. The Celts, of course, had no idea that their carefully constructed festival would persist for millennia. They could not have imagined that their turnip lanterns would become jack-o'-lanterns, their ancestor offerings would become trick-or-treating, their sacred bonfires would become backyard fire pits for roasting marshmallows. They were simply doing what humans have always done, creating meaning from fear, building community from isolation, and insisting that darkness, however long and cold, would eventually give way to light. They believed, these ancient Celts, that ghosts followed strict seasonal schedules, that the dead could be relied upon to visit during specific calendar windows, as punctual as any living guest. It was a charming notion, really. The idea that even the afterlife operated according to reliable principles, that the supernatural world was governed by rules as predictable as the harvest cycle. Whether the dead actually cooperated with this schedule, we cannot say. But the living certainly found comfort in believing it. And that belief, that comfort, that entire elaborate structure of ritual and meaning, all of it was about to encounter something that would change it forever. Not destroy it, not exactly, but reshape it, reframe it, and eventually claim it as something else entirely. The Romans were coming, and they had opinions about how festivals should be conducted. The Roman legions arrived in Celtic lands with their usual confidence, their roads, and their conviction that civilization meant doing things the Roman way. They brought aqueducts and amphitheaters, law codes and Latin, the Pax Romana, and a remarkable talent for absorbing local customs while somehow making them Roman. The conquest of Celtic territories was gradual, stretching across centuries, but wherever Roman authority established itself, a familiar pattern emerged. They would defeat the local peoples militarily, impose Roman governance, and then, in a move that demonstrated either impressive cultural sophistication or simply pragmatic administration, they would look at the local religious calendar and say, well, we can work with this. The Romans, you see, were already celebrating something remarkably similar to Samhain, albeit with their own cultural flavour. Two festivals, actually, both falling at roughly the same time of year, both dealing with themes of death, remembrance, and the harvest's end. Feralia was the first, a day in late October dedicated to honouring the dead. Roman families would visit the tombs of their ancestors, leave offerings of grain and salt, perform rituals meant to placate the restless spirits of the departed. The theology differed from Celtic beliefs. The Romans had their own complex understanding of the afterlife, their own categories of spirits and shades, but the practical observance looked remarkably familiar. Food for the dead, respect for ancestors, a specific time set aside to acknowledge that the departed still held claims on the living. Then there was Pomona's festival, celebrating the Roman goddess of fruit trees and orchards. Her sacred day occurred around November 1st, marking the final harvest of tree fruits, particularly apples. The Romans honoured her with offerings of fruit, with prayers for future harvests, with games and celebrations that marked the agricultural year's conclusion. When Roman administrators encountered Samhain, they must have experienced something like recognition. Here were the Celtic peoples already gathering at the end of October to honour their dead, to mark the harvest's end, to light bonfires and leave offerings. How remarkably convenient. How easily this could be incorporated into the Roman festival calendar. How simple it would be to suggest that really, underneath the superficial differences, everyone was celebrating essentially the same things. Because nothing says eternal empire quite like convincing conquered peoples that their festivals were Roman all along. The blending was gradual, organic, the kind of cultural fusion that happens when peoples are forced to live under shared governance. Roman soldiers stationed in Celtic territories participated in Samhain fires, finding them not so different from their own autumnal celebrations. Celtic peoples adopted aspects of Roman festivals, discovering that honouring Pomona didn't require abandoning their own traditions. The turnip lanterns appeared alongside Roman offerings of fruit. The Druids' divination practices coexisted with Roman augury. And apples, Pomona's sacred fruit, became woven into the fabric of Samhain celebrations in ways that would prove remarkably persistent. The games played at Samhain began to feature apples prominently. Bobbing for apples, which sounds like harmless party entertainment to modern ears, was originally a divination practice combining Roman and Celtic elements. The apple you caught, the way you caught it, the number of attempts required. All of this supposedly revealed information about your future, particularly regarding marriage and prosperity. Apples were peeled in single, unbroken strips and thrown over the shoulder. The shape they formed on the ground would reveal the initial of a future spouse. Apples were hung on strings or floated in water, creating challenges that were simultaneously games and prophecies. The fruit sacred to Pomona became a vehicle for the Celtic practice of seeking visions of what was to come. The Romans also brought organizational skills to the Celtic festival calendar. The Druids had maintained their own complex system of timekeeping, but Roman administrators loved nothing more than a good calendar reform. They mapped Samhain onto their own October-November observances, creating a hybrid festival that honored both Roman and Celtic traditions, while ultimately serving Roman interests, specifically the interest of having conquered peoples continue their traditional celebrations in ways that did not challenge Roman authority. This pattern of absorption and adaptation would prove to be remarkably successful. The Romans did not try to eliminate Samhain. They had learned from earlier mistakes that suppressing local religions tended to create martyrs and resistance. Instead, they added to it, layered their own meanings over it, and gradually transformed it into something that looked Roman even as it remained fundamentally Celtic. The bonfires still burned, but now they honored Roman war dead alongside Celtic ancestors. The offerings of food still appeared at doorsteps, but they might include Roman delicacies alongside traditional Celtic fare. The turnip lanterns still warded off evil spirits, but those spirits were now understood through Roman demonology as well as Celtic tradition. And here we observe one of humanity's more endearing qualities, the ability to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, to honor multiple traditions at once, to celebrate everything and sort out the theology later. The people living in Romanized Celtic territories likely did not spend much time worrying about whether they were celebrating Samhain or Feralia or Pomona's festival. They simply knew that late October required fires, offerings, gatherings, and a healthy respect for the boundary between life and death. The conquering empires always seem to think local traditions look better with apples, apparently. And in this case, they were not entirely wrong. The apple additions enriched the festival, added new layers of meaning, new practices that would endure long after both the Romans and the Celts had faded into history. But the Roman influence, significant as it was, represented merely one transformation in the long evolution of these autumn observances. The empire that seemed eternal was already showing cracks by the time Samhain had fully absorbed its Roman additions. The legions were withdrawing from the furthest provinces. The roads were falling into disrepair, and a new power was rising. One that would look at these hybrid pagan festivals and see not an opportunity for absorption, but a problem requiring solution. The Christian Church was growing, spreading, developing its own calendar of observances, and it had very specific ideas about how to handle holidays that involved bonfires, spirit visitation, and the celebration of a Celtic New Year. The bishops were coming, and they had opinions about everything. The early Christian Church faced a peculiar problem as it spread across Europe. The people it sought to convert already had religions, complex, deeply rooted spiritual systems with their own festivals, their own sacred days, their own ways of marking time and meaning. These beliefs could not simply be eradicated, not without creating martyrs and resistance. But neither could they be allowed to continue unchanged, not if Christianity was to establish itself as the dominant faith. The solution the Church developed was elegant in its cunning. If you cannot eliminate the old holidays, transform them, rebrand them, absorb them into the Christian calendar with enough alteration to make them doctrinally acceptable, but enough familiarity to make them emotionally resonant. This approach had already proven successful with other pagan festivals. The winter solstice celebrations had become Christmas. The spring fertility festivals had been reshaped into Easter. The Church had learned that people were far more willing to abandon their old gods if they could keep their old party dates. Samhain, with its massive bonfires, its communion with the dead, and its 3 days of supernatural observance, presented both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge was obvious. Here was a major festival deeply embedded in the cultural life of Celtic peoples, one that showed no signs of fading as Christianity spread. The opportunity was equally clear. The themes of Samhain aligned remarkably well with certain Christian concepts: death, remembrance, the relationship between the living and the dead. These were concerns Christianity addressed, albeit from a different theological position. The Church's solution emerged in the 8th century, though it built upon earlier developments. Pope Gregory III designated November 1st as All Saints' Day, a time to honor all Christian saints and martyrs, known and unknown, who had achieved heavenly glory. The night before this sacred day, the evening of October 31st, became All Hallows' Eve. Hallow being an Old English word meaning saint or holy person. Thus, the Eve of All Saints became All Hallows' Eve, which would eventually contract into Halloween. The political brilliance of this move cannot be overstated. The Church had taken the Celtic New Year, the night when the veil between worlds thinned and the dead walked among the living, and transformed it into a Christian vigil before a day of sanctified remembrance. Samhain's bonfires could continue. They were now lit to honor Christian martyrs. The offerings to the dead could persist. They were now prayers for souls in purgatory. The gathering of communities could be maintained. They now assembled to celebrate Christian fellowship. But of course, rebranding a festival on paper is one thing. Convincing people to actually change their observances is quite another. The Church discovered what every marketing executive has learned. You can change the official name and stated purpose of a celebration, but the actual practices tend to be remarkably sticky. The people of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and other Celtic regions heard about All Hallows' Eve, nodded politely, and continued lighting their Samhain fires. They might say a Christian prayer or two while doing it. Why not? But they also left food for the spirits, wore their disguises, performed their divination rituals, and maintained all the practices their ancestors had developed for navigating this dangerous threshold night. The Church, to its credit, demonstrated flexibility. Rather than demanding complete abandonment of traditional practices, it worked to Christianize them gradually, to layer Christian meaning over pagan action until the two became inseparable. This process, sometimes called baptizing pagan customs, created a hybrid festival that was simultaneously Christian and Celtic, holy and folkloric, orthodox and wildly superstitious. By the 9th century, the Church had added November 2nd to its calendar as All Souls' Day, a day specifically dedicated to praying for the souls of all the faithful departed, particularly those still suffering in purgatory. This created a 3-day sequence: All Hallows' Eve on October 31st, All Saints' Day on November 1st, All Souls' Day on November 2nd. The Church had, in essence, matched the Celtic 3-day observance with its own 3-day festival. Because nothing says successful religious conversion quite like borrowing someone else's pagan festival calendar and adding prayer. The Church introduced new practices, meant to replace or Christianize the old ones. Souling emerged as a Christian alternative to the Celtic custom of leaving food for the dead. Poor people would go door to door on All Souls' Day, offering to pray for the departed in exchange for soul cakes, small round cakes marked with a cross. Each cake eaten represented a soul released from purgatory through the prayers of the living. It was quid pro quo theology made delicious. The practice contained echoes of the old Samhain customs, going door to door, receiving food, acknowledging the dead, but now packaged in Christian terminology. The spirits being fed were no longer pagan ghosts, but Christian souls in purgatory. The food was no longer an offering to possibly dangerous entities, but a charitable exchange with the living poor. The theology had changed, but the social practice remained remarkably similar. The Church also worked to eliminate or transform the more overtly pagan elements of Samhain. The Druids had already been marginalized as Christianity spread, their religious authority undermined, their social position diminished. The sacred bonfires were reframed as holy fires blessed by priests rather than druids. The divination practices were officially condemned as superstition, though they persisted in folk custom with a thin Christian veneer applied. The belief that the dead returned on this night posed particular theological challenges. Christianity had specific doctrines about the afterlife, about where souls went and under what circumstances they might interact with the living. The casual commerce between living and dead that Samhain assumed did not fit comfortably with Christian eschatology. The Church's solution was to maintain the connection to the dead, but change its character. The dead were not wandering spirits who might visit their old homes. They were souls in purgatory who needed the prayers of the living. They did not return physically to the world. They were remembered and assisted through Christian intercession. The veil did not thin. Rather, the living reached out through prayer to help those who had passed beyond. But theology and practice rarely align perfectly, and the people of Christian Europe developed a remarkably flexible understanding of these matters. They would attend church services on All Saints' Day, pray dutifully for the souls in purgatory on All Souls' Day, and then, often on the same evening, leave out food for spirits, perform divination rituals, and tell stories about the dead walking abroad. This was not hypocrisy, exactly. It was the human talent for holding multiple frameworks of understanding simultaneously, for being both faithful Christians and inheritors of ancient traditions. The church authorities were not blind to this contradiction. Sermons were preached against superstitious practices. Priests condemned fortune-telling, warned against leaving offerings for spirits, and insisted on the proper Christian understanding of death and the afterlife. And the people listened respectfully, agreed with the theological points being made, and then went home and did exactly as their grandparents had taught them. Because faith is one thing, but generations of accumulated wisdom about how to survive the dangerous threshold night is quite another. The rebranding of Samhain into All Hallows' Eve was neither complete nor simple. What emerged was something hybrid, a festival that carried Christian names and included Christian observances while retaining the deep structure of the Celtic original. The bonfires still burned, even if they were now blessed by priests. The dead were still remembered, even if the theology of that remembrance had shifted. The boundary between worlds was still acknowledged, even if it was now discussed in terms of purgatory and intercession rather than veils and wandering spirits. This hybrid festival would continue to evolve, to absorb new influences and shed old practices, to transform with each century and each culture that encountered it. But the foundation had been laid. A night in late October, when the living acknowledged the dead, when communities gathered against the darkness, when the normal rules of existence seemed suspended, however briefly. The church had cleaned house, certainly. It had imposed Christian order on pagan chaos, holy meaning on folk custom. But underneath the clean ecclesiastical surface, the old patterns persisted. The fire, the darkness, the gathering, the fear, the defiance, all of it remained, dressed now in Christian language, but essentially unchanged. And the people continued their celebrations, navigating between official doctrine and traditional practice with the ease of long experience. They were Christians, certainly, but they were also heirs to something older, something that had survived Roman conquest and would now survive Christian conversion. The night of October 31st was All Hallows' Eve in the church calendar, but in the hearts and habits of the people it was still Samhain, the night when anything might happen, when the dead drew close, when light and darkness struggled for dominance, and when humanity gathered together to face whatever emerged from the shadows. The bishops had done their work, but the bonfires still burned. By the medieval period, All Hallows' Eve had settled into the fabric of European Christian life, particularly in the British Isles and Ireland, where Celtic traditions remained strongest. The festival had acquired a peculiar double identity, officially Christian, unofficially pagan, and practically something altogether different from either source. The medieval church continued its attempts to direct the observance toward properly holy ends. Priests led processions through village streets, carrying relics of saints, chanting prayers for the dead, blessing homes against evil influences. Churches held special vigils on the night of October 31st, with the faithful encouraged to spend the dangerous hours in prayer rather than revelry. The theology was clear. This was a solemn time of Christian remembrance, not an occasion for pagan mischief. The people, naturally, ignored about half of this advice and enthusiastically embraced the rest. What emerged in medieval Europe was a festival that managed to be simultaneously devout and subversive, holy and raucous, deeply traditional and constantly innovative. The various practices associated with All Hallows' Eve created a kind of cultural kaleidoscope. Turn it slightly, and you saw Christian piety. Turn it again, and ancient paganism appeared. Turn it once more, and you found something else entirely, something that belonged wholly to the medieval world. Souling, the practice of going door to door to pray for the dead in exchange for soul cakes, became increasingly elaborate and theatrical. The soul cakes themselves evolved from simple marked rounds into more complex confections, sometimes containing fruit or spices, other times decorated with symbols of death and resurrection. The practice was especially popular among children and the poor, who found in it both spiritual purpose and material benefit. The solars would sing as they went from house to house, their songs mixing Christian themes with folk melodies that predated the church by centuries. Soul, soul, a soul cake. Please, good Mrs. A soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. The theology was impeccable. Every cake earned prayers for the dead. Every prayer released a soul from purgatory. But the practice looked suspiciously like organized begging with a spiritual justification. The church approved more or less, because at least people were praying. The householders participated because tradition demanded it, and because refusing soul cakes might bring bad luck, though they would never admit to believing in luck, which was terribly pagan. The solars benefited from full stomachs and the satisfaction of performing a holy duty. Everyone involved understood they were participating in something that was not quite what it appeared to be, and no one much cared to examine it too closely. Alongside souling, the medieval period saw the flourishing of mumming and guising, practices that would have looked remarkably familiar to the ancient Celts who first donned disguises on Samhain. People, especially young people, would dress in costumes representing the dead, spirits, or supernatural beings. They would move through villages in groups, performing short plays or songs, demanding gifts or treats from households they visited. The costumes served multiple purposes, as medieval practices often did. Officially, the disguises represented souls in purgatory or saints in heaven, a pious visual representation of the holy dead being honored on All Saints' Day. Unofficially, they were protection against evil spirits, a way of confusing any malevolent entities that might be abroad on this dangerous night. Practically, they were an excuse for young people to behave with a freedom normally forbidden to them, shielded by anonymity and tradition. The plays performed by guisers were wonderfully strange, mixing Christian morality with folk tales, incorporating elements of the old Samhain beliefs with contemporary medieval concerns. Death appeared as a character, sometimes frightening, sometimes comic. Saints performed miracles. The devil made appearances, usually to be outwitted by clever peasants or holy hermits. These performances were theatre, education, entertainment, and ritual observance all tangled together. And the practice of wearing frightening or grotesque masks persisted, now justified through Christian logic, but serving the same purpose it had for the Celts. You might dress as death itself, not because you wanted to honor death, but because if death was already present in costume form, perhaps the real thing would look elsewhere for victims. You might wear the face of a demon, not because you worshipped demons, but because in appearing demonic, you became invisible to actual demons. The logic was impeccable if you did not think about it too carefully. The Church, wisely, chose not to think about it too carefully. The carved turnips persisted as well, though in medieval Christian context they acquired new meaning. The faces carved into them were now said to represent souls in purgatory, their grotesque expressions depicting the suffering that prayer and soul cakes would alleviate. Or they represented the damned, their horrifying visages serving as reminders of what awaited the unrepentant. Or they were simply decorative, a traditional craft with no particular meaning beyond custom. The truth, as usual, was probably all of these things, and none of them. The turnip lanterns were carved because they had always been carved, because the practice connected medieval Christians to their ancestors, because the light they provided was both practical and symbolic, because they looked properly eerie on a night when eeriness was expected. Bonfires remained central to the observance, though their purpose had been thoroughly Christianized in official discourse. These were now fires lit to honor Christian martyrs, particularly those who had been burned for their faith. Prayers were said as the fires were kindled. Prayers were said as the fires were kindled. Blessings invoked over the flames. Communities gathered around these sanctified blazes to share food, tell stories, and mark the turning of the season with proper Christian solemnity. And then, once the prayers were finished, they engaged in precisely the same activities their pagan ancestors had performed around their Samhain fires. They divined the future by watching the patterns of smoke. They threw objects into the flames and interpreted the way they burned. They circled the fires in ritual patterns, made wishes, told ghost stories that would have horrified their priests had those priests been paying attention. The divination practices were particularly persistent, despite official church disapproval. Young women sought visions of future husbands through increasingly elaborate rituals. They would comb their hair while looking into mirrors at midnight, hoping to see the face of their future spouse reflected behind them. They would eat apples while performing similar mirror rituals. They would throw nuts into the fire. If the nuts burned quietly, the marriage would be peaceful. If they popped and cracked, discord lay ahead. Young men engaged in similar practices, though their divination often took more physical forms. They would participate in tests of strength and skill, believing that performance in these contests predicted their fortunes in the coming year. They would race through darkness, perform dangerous leaps over bonfires, engage in mock battles, all supposedly revealing information about their futures, but also serving as displays of vigor and courage before an audience of potential brides and rivals. The Church condemned these practices regularly and ineffectually. Divination was superstition. Priests insisted from their pulpits. Fortune-telling was trafficking with demonic forces. The future belonged to God alone, and attempting to discern it through nuts and mirrors was both foolish and sinful. The people listened, nodded, and continued throwing nuts into fires, because theological correctness was important, certainly, but so was knowing whether your marriage would be happy. Priorities, after all, must be maintained. Food played an enormous role in medieval All Hallows Eve celebrations, as it had in the original Samhain observances. The feasting that occurred had practical origins. This was the time of year when livestock was slaughtered for winter, when the harvest had been completed, when food was abundant before the lean months began. It made sense to feast now, to celebrate the bounty while it lasted. But the meals served on All Hallows Eve carried symbolic weight as well. Places were still set for the dead, though now these were specifically for deceased family members whose souls were in purgatory. Food was prepared with care, offered with prayer, consumed with the awareness that the boundary between life and death was, on this night, particularly permeable. Special dishes emerged, regional variations that marked the night as distinct from ordinary meals. In some areas, they prepared dumb cakes, so called because they were made in complete silence, the bakers forbidden to speak during preparation. These cakes were eaten before bed on All Hallows' Eve, supposedly to induce prophetic dreams about future spouses. In other regions, specific breads were baked with symbolic objects hidden inside. Find a ring, and you would marry soon. Find a coin, and you would prosper. Find a thimble, and you would remain unmarried. The practice of hiding objects in food would prove remarkably persistent, surviving in various forms into the modern era. It combined several impulses that humans seem unable to resist: the love of surprise, the appeal of fortune-telling, and the ever-present hope that we might learn something about our futures without having to actually make difficult decisions in the present. The medieval church also introduced the practice of bell ringing on All Hallows' Eve and All Souls' Day. Church bells would toll throughout the night, sometimes in specific patterns believed to guide lost souls, other times simply to mark the sacred time. The sound of bells ringing across dark countryside must have been both comforting and eerie, a reminder of Christian community and divine protection, but also an acknowledgement that protection was needed, that the night held dangers requiring supernatural defense. Towns and villages developed their own particular customs, local variations that made All Hallows' Eve distinctive to each place. In some areas, they extinguished all lights at midnight and then relit them from a communal flame, echoing the ancient Samhain practice, but now framed as Christian renewal. In others, they held processions of the dead, elaborate pageants where costumed participants represented the souls in purgatory, pleading for prayers and demonstrating the consequences of sin. These processions could be quite sophisticated, essentially medieval performance art with theological purpose. Participants might carry signs listing their sins in life, wear chains to represent their bondage to vice, or perform actions demonstrating their suffering and repentance. The living who watched were meant to be moved to prayer, to charity, to soul cakes, and intercession. They were also, undoubtedly, entertained, because nothing quite captures attention like a good demonstration of eternal suffering. The nobility celebrated All Hallows' Eve with particular extravagance, hosting elaborate feasts and entertainments. These grand celebrations incorporated the folk customs of the peasantry, but elevated them with aristocratic refinement, or at least with more expensive food and costumes. The wealthy might host masquerade balls, where guests arrived in elaborate costumes representing allegorical concepts, historical figures, or supernatural beings. They would stage elaborate pageants, hire musicians and performers, create temporary paradises of light and luxury in their halls, while darkness reigned outside. But even in these aristocratic celebrations, the fundamental elements persisted: the acknowledgement of death, the remembrance of ancestors, the sense that on this night the normal order of things was suspended. A nobleman might dress as death itself and dance among his guests, a visceral reminder that wealth and power provided no escape from mortality. A lady might appear as a soul in purgatory, her costume simultaneously beautiful and haunting, a demonstration that even the blessed dead required the prayers of the living. The medieval period also saw the development of increasingly elaborate ghost stories associated with All Hallows' Eve. The Church had its official position on ghosts. They were either demons masquerading as the dead, or souls permitted by God to return for specific purposes. But in folk tradition, ghosts were simply the dead, returning because the veil was thin, because they had unfinished business, because this was the night when such things happened. These stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, certainly. Humans have always loved being frightened in safe circumstances. They educated, providing moral instruction about the consequences of sin and the importance of dying in a state of grace. They preserved history, passing down accounts of local tragedies and notable deaths, and they reinforced community bonds as people gathered to share these tales, to frighten each other, to feel the comfort of companionship when the stories grew too dark. The telling of ghost stories on All Hallows' Eve would become one of the festival's most enduring traditions, surviving every subsequent transformation and transplantation. There is something fundamentally human about gathering in firelight to speak of the dead, to invoke them through story, to acknowledge that they were once alive and might yet have claims on the world of the living. As medieval Europe progressed toward the early modern period, All Hallows' Eve had become a festival that defied simple categorization. It was Christian in name and official observance, pagan in structure and many practices, and medieval in its particular combination of piety and mischief. The Church had successfully imposed its calendar and theology on the ancient Celtic festival, but it had not, perhaps could not, eliminate the older meanings and practices. What had emerged was something genuinely hybrid, a festival that belonged fully to neither its pagan past nor its Christian present, but rather to the people who celebrated it. They performed Christian rituals because they were Christian, but they also performed pagan-derived customs because they were the inheritors of those traditions. They prayed for souls in purgatory and divined their futures with nuts and mirrors. They attended church vigils and told ghost stories. They honored saints and wore frightening masks. The theological contradictions troubled priests and bishops who continued their efforts to purify the observance, to eliminate the superstitious elements, to focus celebration on properly Christian themes. But the people had developed a remarkable ability to navigate between official doctrine and traditional practice, to be both faithful and folkloric, to honor both church teaching and ancestral wisdom. Because pretending to be dead for snacks, it turned out, was a surprisingly enduring concept. The soul cakes might now come with prayers attached. The costumes might now represent Christian rather than pagan themes, and the theological justification might have changed entirely. But the essential practice remained. Go door to door, dress strangely, receive food, acknowledge death, and celebrate the community that persists despite all endings. The medieval synthesis of All Hallows' Eve would not last forever. The Protestant Reformation was approaching, bringing with it new theological challenges to traditional practices. The age of exploration was beginning, promising to carry European customs to distant shores. Massive social changes would transform the festival yet again, adapting it to new contexts and new understandings. But for now, in medieval Europe, All Hallows' Eve had found a kind of equilibrium, Christian enough to survive church scrutiny, traditional enough to satisfy deep human needs, flexible enough to incorporate new practices while maintaining ancient patterns. The bonfires burned, the bells rang, the solars sang, the geysers performed, and the dead were remembered in ways both orthodox and wildly heretical. The night belonged to the living and the dead together, to Christians and pagans, and everyone who existed in the complicated space between. It was holy, and it was haunted, sacred and superstitious, a festival of contradictions that somehow worked, because humans have always been capable of believing 6 impossible things before breakfast and a dozen more by nightfall. The medieval world would pass, as all worlds do. But the festival it had shaped, this peculiar hybrid of Celtic fire and Christian prayer, of ancient practice and medieval innovation, would prove remarkably resilient. It was ready to travel, to transform, to carry its contradictions across oceans and centuries. The voyage west was coming, and the festival was about to discover what it could become when removed from the European soil that had nurtured it for millennia. The Irish and Scottish immigrants who crossed the Atlantic in the 18th and 19th centuries packed very little. Most brought only what they could carry: clothes, tools, perhaps a few treasured possessions small enough to survive the journey. They left behind homes, land, the graves of their ancestors, the landscapes that had shaped their understanding of the world. They carried hardship with them, hunger in many cases, the memory of failed crops and crushing poverty, the desperate hope that somewhere across that vast ocean a better life might be possible. But they also carried, invisible and indestructible, their festivals, their songs and stories, their customs and beliefs, their calendar of observances that marked the year with meaning. These required no trunk space, paid no passage fees. They existed in memory and habit, in the knowledge of how things had always been done, in the determination to maintain some connection to the world they were leaving. All Hallows Eve came to America in the hearts and minds of Irish and Scottish immigrants. It arrived in fragments and variations, different families carrying different versions of the old traditions. Some brought elaborate customs from their home villages, complete with specific songs, particular games, precise ways of carving turnips or telling fortunes. Others brought only vague memories of gatherings and ghost stories, the details lost, but the feeling of the night somehow preserved. The early American context wasn't immediately hospitable to these traditions. The Puritan colonies, particularly in New England, regarded most celebrations with suspicion and anything resembling pagan practice with outright hostility. They had come to the New World to establish godly communities, to worship without the corrupting influence of Catholic excess and pagan residue. Holidays were dangerous distractions from proper piety, and holidays involving ghosts and fortune-telling were particularly problematic. All Hallows Eve in these early American communities was largely suppressed or ignored. If it was acknowledged at all, it was purely as a religious observance, a solemn day for remembering the dead, with none of the associated festivities or folk practices. The Puritans certainly did not approve of dressing in costumes, telling ghost stories, or engaging in divination. These were precisely the kinds of frivolous or superstitious activities they had crossed an ocean to escape. But America was not uniformly Puritan. The middle colonies and southern colonies had more diverse populations, more tolerant attitudes toward celebration, and more Catholic and Anglican communities that maintained traditional feast day observances. In Maryland, with its large Catholic population, All Hallows' Eve found more welcoming ground. In areas with significant Scots-Irish settlement, the old customs persisted in modified form. And crucially, the 19th century brought wave after wave of Irish immigration, particularly following the Great Famine of the 1840s. These immigrants arrived in enormous numbers, settling in cities and rural areas, bringing with them a fierce determination to maintain their cultural identity in this strange new land. If they could not bring Ireland itself, they would recreate it as best they could. And that recreation included the festivals that had structured Irish life for centuries. The Irish immigrants celebrated All Hallows' Eve with deliberate enthusiasm, partly for its own sake and partly as an assertion of identity. To celebrate as their parents and grandparents had celebrated was to remain Irish in America, to maintain connection with the homeland, even as they struggled to build new lives. The festival became a way of preserving community, of gathering people who shared memory and custom, of insisting that they had not lost everything in crossing the Atlantic. In Irish neighborhoods, particularly in cities like New York and Boston, All Hallows' Eve began to flourish in recognizable form. They held gatherings in homes and community halls, recreating the parties and games they remembered from Ireland. They told the same ghost stories, performed the same divination rituals, prepared the same traditional foods, or as close to the same as American ingredients would allow. The turnip lanterns presented an immediate problem. Turnips in America were not quite the same as the large, pale turnips of Ireland and Scotland. They were smaller, harder to carve, less satisfactory for creating the traditional hollowed-out lanterns with their eerie faces. But America offered an alternative: pumpkins. These large orange gourds were native to North America, unfamiliar to European immigrants, but abundantly available, especially in autumn. Someone, history has not preserved the name of this practical genius, realized that pumpkins were vastly superior to turnips for lantern carving purposes. They were larger, their flesh was softer and easier to carve, and they held a candle beautifully. The jack-o'-lantern, as it would come to be known, was about to undergo a significant transformation. What had been a turnip-based Irish tradition was becoming something distinctly American, or rather, something Irish-American, a hybrid creation born from the meeting of old custom and new environment. The transition from turnip to pumpkin occurred gradually across the middle decades of the 19th century. Irish families discovered the advantages of pumpkin carving and shared the technique with their communities. Children found pumpkins easier to work with than turnips, allowing them to participate in the tradition more fully. And the visual impact was undeniable. A carved pumpkin, glowing from within, was more impressive than the turnip lanterns of the old country. But the practice retained its original purpose, even as the vegetable changed. These carved pumpkins were not mere decorations, not in those early years. They were still protective devices, wards against evil spirits, symbolic representations of the boundary between light and darkness, life and death. They were placed on doorsteps and windowsills to guard homes, to guide friendly spirits and deter malevolent ones, to mark October 31st, as a night when the usual rules were suspended. The American context also began to change other aspects of the celebration. The souling tradition, so important in medieval Europe, translated awkwardly to American circumstances. Going door to pray for the dead in exchange for soul cakes made sense in a society with a robust belief in purgatory and established traditions of charity. In America, particularly in Protestant areas, the theological foundation was shakier and the custom less understood. But the basic practice, going door to door in costume to receive treats, that had appeal. Children, particularly Irish-American children, began to engage in what they called guising or mumming, dressing in costumes and visiting neighbors. The explicitly religious element faded in many cases, replaced by simple entertainment. The children would perform a song, tell a joke, recite a poem, and receive apples, nuts, or small coins in return. The phrase trick or treat had not yet emerged, but the basic transaction was forming. Costumes earned rewards. Performance, however minimal, justified the asking. And householders, whether or not they fully understood the tradition, generally played along, because the alternative was to seem churlish, and because the custom was harmless enough. The Scottish immigrants brought their own variations, particularly the practice of guising, which in Scotland had developed elaborate performance traditions. Scottish-American children would arrive at doors prepared to sing, dance, tell jokes, or recite poetry. They earned their treats through entertainment. This expectation of performance would influence the American development of the tradition, creating a foundation for the later, simpler trick-or-treat exchange. The divination practices crossed the Atlantic with particular vigor, especially those related to romance and marriage. Young Irish and Scottish women in America continued the tradition of using All Hallows' Eve to divine information about their future spouses. They threw apple peels over their shoulders, hoping to see initials. They performed mirror rituals at midnight. They participated in games designed to reveal romantic futures. These practices were not merely superstition to the young women who engaged in them, nor simple entertainment. In communities where marriage prospects were limited and futures uncertain, any glimpse into what lay ahead had real value, or at least provided real comfort. The rituals connected them to their mothers and grandmothers, to generations of women who had sought the same reassurance on the same night. The American setting added its own elements to these romantic divinations. In rural areas, corn, maize, became incorporated into fortune-telling practices. Corn kernels were used in place of nuts for fire divination. Corn husks were examined for symbolic meanings. The harvest festivals of American agriculture began to blend with the imported European traditions, creating new hybrid practices. As the 19th century progressed, All Hallows' Eve began to move beyond exclusively Irish and Scottish communities. The festival started appearing in broader American culture, adopted and adapted by people with no direct connection to Celtic traditions. The appeal was obvious. A night of parties, costumes, ghost stories, and games had universal attraction, regardless of one's ancestral background. American newspapers began to run stories about All Hallows' Eve celebrations, explaining the traditions to readers unfamiliar with them. Women's magazines offered suggestions for hosting All Hallows' Eve parties, complete with recipes, decoration ideas, and descriptions of traditional games. The festival was being domesticated, transformed from an ethnic tradition into an American celebration, or at least into something that could be marketed to Americans as a delightful seasonal festivity. The timing helped considerably. America lacked major festivals in autumn. Thanksgiving was important, certainly, but it came late in November and had a different character. Solemn, family-oriented, focused on gratitude rather than celebration. All Hallows' Eve filled a gap in the American calendar, offering a festival at the perfect moment when harvest was complete and winter approached, when the world was at its most visually appealing with autumn colors, when the weather was cool enough for gatherings, but not yet harsh. The Irish immigrants had brought a festival, but America was transforming it into something new. The religious elements continued to fade, not eliminated, but pushed to the margins as the celebration became more secular and entertainment-focused. The specific Celtic and medieval Christian meanings were being forgotten or simplified, replaced by a more general association with autumn, harvest, ghosts, and fun. This process of transformation was neither simple nor uniform. In some communities, particularly those with strong Irish or Scottish identity, the older traditions persisted with relatively little change. In others, All Hallows' Eve was becoming something altogether different. An American harvest festival, with some European trappings, a costume party with vaguely spooky themes, a children's celebration only loosely connected to its origins. The pumpkin, meanwhile, was becoming central to the American version of the festival. Not just carved jack-o'-lanterns, but pumpkins as decoration, pumpkins as food, pumpkins as the visual symbol of autumn itself. The large orange gourds appeared on porches, in windows, as centerpieces at parties. Pumpkin pies became associated with the season, linking the harvest festival aspect with the supernatural observance. By the late 19th century, All Hallows' Eve was approaching a new phase in its long evolution. It had survived the voyage to America, transformed itself to fit new circumstances, and was poised to become something the ancient Celts could never have imagined: a mass commercial celebration, an American cultural export, a global phenomenon. But first, it would need a proper origin story, a legend to explain the jack-o'-lanterns that were becoming so central to the celebration. A tale that would connect the American pumpkin tradition to older European folklore, that would give narrative shape to the glowing carved faces that appeared every October. The Irish brought the perfect story, one they had been telling for generations. It involved a man, a turnip, and a very bad decision regarding the devil. In America, the turnip would become a pumpkin. But the man, well, his name was Jack, and his legend was about to become inseparable from the festival itself. The legend of Stingy Jack exists in dozens of variations, as folklore tends to do. The details shift depending on who is telling the story and where, but the essential elements remain consistent because the tale serves a purpose that transcends any specific telling. It explains the jack-o'-lantern, yes, but more importantly, it provides a narrative for the deeper themes of All Hallows' Eve. The boundary between life and death, the consequences of cleverness without wisdom, and the strange mercy that can exist even in damnation. The story goes something like this. In Ireland, in a time that is deliberately left vague because specific dates would ruin the mythic quality, there lived a man named Jack. Jack was a blacksmith in some versions, a farmer in others, occasionally a wanderer with no fixed trade. The occupation matters less than his character, which was uniformly described as unpleasant. Jack was a drunkard and a miser, mean-spirited and manipulative, the kind of man who would cheat his own mother if he thought he could profit from it. The nickname Stingy Jack was not a term of endearment. On All Hallows Eve, because of course this story must take place on that specific night, Jack was drinking at a pub, working his way toward his customary state of profound intoxication. His money, as usual, was running low. And then the devil appeared. The devil's appearance varies with the telling. Sometimes he manifests as a well-dressed stranger, sometimes as a dark figure in the corner, occasionally as an obvious demon complete with horns and tail. Subtlety was apparently optional. But his purpose was clear. He had come to collect Jack's soul, which by all reasonable accounting was long overdue for collection. Jack, drunk but not so drunk as to miss the significance of the devil's presence, did what he did best. He schemed. He convinced the devil to have one last drink with him before taking his soul. Just one drink, a final courtesy before eternal damnation. The devil, either amused or simply confident in the inevitable outcome, agreed. When the drinks arrived, Jack pretended to search for coins to pay the bill. He turned to the devil and suggested that the Prince of Darkness could surely transform himself into a coin, a simple trick for one of his power. The devil, who apparently never learned that pride goes before a fall, obliged. He transformed into a silver coin, which Jack immediately snatched and thrust into his pocket, where he also happened to keep a crucifix. Trapped in proximity to a holy object, the devil could not resume his true form. He was caught or outsmarted by a drunken Irish miser, which must have been embarrassing for the father of lies. Jack, pressing his advantage, made the devil swear not to claim his soul for 10 years. Some versions specify 1 year, others say 10. The number hardly matters, only the principle. Jack had negotiated a stay of execution through trickery and a conveniently placed crucifix. The devil, having little choice, agreed. Jack released him, and the evil one vanished, presumably to plot more carefully next time. The years passed, 1 or 10, depending on the version, and Jack continued his dissolute life, learning nothing from his narrow escape. He remained drunk, miserly, unpleasant to all who knew him, and when the appointed time arrived, the devil returned. Once again, Jack's soul was forfeit. Once again, Jack had a scheme. This time, he asked the devil for one last favor before they departed for hell. There was an apple tree nearby, convenient in the way that trees in folk tales always are, and Jack expressed a desire for one final apple before eternal torment began. The devil, perhaps curious to see what trick Jack might attempt, agreed. The devil climbed the tree to fetch the apple, and Jack, in a move he had clearly planned, immediately carved crosses into the trunk, trapping the devil in the branches. Holy symbols surrounded him. He could not descend without touching them. Jack's demand this time was bolder. The devil must promise never to claim his soul. Not for 10 years, not for 100 years. Never. complete and permanent immunity from hell. The devil, furious but trapped, agreed. What choice did he have? He swore never to take Jack's soul, and Jack removed the crosses. The devil descended from the tree and vanished, this time, presumably forever. Jack must have thought himself remarkably clever. He had outwitted the devil twice, secured eternal immunity from hell. He could continue his unpleasant life without fear of supernatural consequences. But Jack, like most clever people who lack wisdom, had not thought things through. Time passed, as it does even for the wicked, and eventually Jack died. His body wore out, his drinking caught up with him. The years of dissolution took their toll. His soul, released from flesh, went where souls are supposed to go. He approached the gates of heaven, assuming admission. But heaven, it turned out, wanted nothing to do with him. His life had been selfish, cruel, marked by every vice and no virtues. The gates remained closed. Jack was turned away. Well, he thought, if not heaven, then hell would have to take him. Everyone goes somewhere after all. He made his way to the gates of hell, knocked, and waited. The devil appeared, and with what one imagines was enormous satisfaction, reminded Jack of their agreement. He had sworn never to take Jack's soul. A devil's promise, once given, must be kept. Even hell has rules. Jack could not enter. "Where am I to go then?" Jack asked, suddenly realizing the scope of his mistake. "Back where you came from," the devil replied. But the way back was dark, utterly black, impossible to navigate. Jack complained, a bit rich given the circumstances, and the devil, in a gesture that might have been mercy, or might simply have been the final twist of the knife, tossed Jack a burning coal from the fires of hell. Jack caught the coal. He needed something to carry it in, some way to protect the ember and use its light. He found a turnip. Accounts vary on how exactly he obtained it, but this is folklore, which doesn't trouble itself with such details. He carved out the turnip, placed the coal inside, and created a lantern. And so Jack was condemned to wander the earth, neither in heaven nor hell, neither fully alive nor properly dead. He walks in the darkness between worlds, carrying his turnip lantern, searching for a resting place he will never find. The Irish called him Jack of the Lantern, which became Jack-o'-lantern, which became Jack-o'-lantern. On All Hallows' Eve, when the boundary between worlds grows thin, Jack walks closer to the mortal realm. People carve lanterns to represent him, to acknowledge his presence, to remember the lesson his story teaches, that cleverness without virtue is its own damnation, that escaping consequences is not the same as redemption, and that sometimes the worst punishment is getting exactly what you asked for. The legend served multiple purposes in Irish tradition. It explained the jack-o'-lanterns, certainly, why they were carved, what they represented, why they appeared on All Hallows' Eve. But it also functioned as moral instruction, a warning against Jack's specific sins, drunkenness, greed, cleverness, deployed in the service of selfishness rather than virtue. And there was something wonderfully Irish about the story, a particular sensibility that would recognize the bitter humor in Jack's fate. He had been so clever, had outwitted the devil himself twice, and in doing so had secured a fate worse than hell. The story contained a kind of cosmic irony, a sense that the universe has a sense of humor, and it is not always kind. When Irish immigrants brought the story to America, it traveled alongside the tradition of carving vegetables for All Hallows' Eve. The combination was perfect, a legend that explained the practice, that gave narrative depth to what might otherwise seem like mere decoration. And when the turnip became a pumpkin in American soil, Jack's lantern transformed as well. The carved pumpkins glowing on American porches were no longer just protective wards or symbolic representations. They were Jack's lantern, multiplied 1,000-fold, acknowledging his eternal wandering and perhaps offering a little light to guide him, though he could never stop. The legend gave the jack-o'-lantern emotional resonance beyond its practical or traditional purposes. Each carved face was Jack's face, not literally, but metaphorically. Each glowing pumpkin represented someone caught between states, neither here nor there, neither saved nor damned, forever seeking and never finding. And there was something peculiarly appropriate about this becoming the central symbol of All Hallows' Eve in America. Jack was himself a liminal figure, existing between life and death, between heaven and hell, between punishment and mercy. His story was about boundaries and their transgression, about the consequences of trying to escape consequences, about the strange spaces between categories. All Hallows' Eve had always been about such boundaries, between summer and winter, living and dead, natural and supernatural. Jack's legend gave that theme a human face, a narrative embodiment of the liminal spaces the festival acknowledged. The American jack-o'-lantern, carved from a pumpkin's and illuminated by candles, became the most recognizable symbol of Halloween. More than any other single element, the glowing carved pumpkin would come to represent the holiday in popular imagination. Not the Christian saints it was named for, not the Celtic Samhain it descended from, but Jack and his turnip-turned pumpkin, wandering in eternal darkness with his coal from hell, providing just enough light to see that there is nowhere to go. There is something oddly touching in this, beneath the supernatural trappings and moral warnings. Jack is a villain by any measure, selfish, cruel, unrepentant, and yet his punishment moves us. To be denied both heaven and hell, to wander forever without rest, to carry a light that illuminates but doesn't warm. It seems excessive, even for someone who cheated the devil. Perhaps that is why the legend persisted, why it became central to the American celebration. It suggested that even the damned deserved some sympathy, that eternal punishment was pitiable even when just, that light in darkness mattered even when the darkness was self-created. The jack-o'-lantern, glowing on October 31st, represented all of this. It was protection and warning, symbol and story, craft project and theological lesson. It connected the American celebration to Irish roots while transforming into something distinctly American. It gave children something to carve and adults something to contemplate. And it suggested, with its flickering candle flame, that even in the darkest circumstances, even in situations born of our own foolishness, light persists. It may not save us. It certainly didn't save Jack. But it allows us to see where we are, even if where we are is nowhere, forever. The carved pumpkin would become central to Halloween's next transformation as the festival moved from immigrant tradition to American institution. But first, it would need to become respectable, domesticated, suitable for polite society. The Victorians were coming, and they had opinions about how a proper festival should be conducted. The late 19th century brought remarkable changes to American society, and with those changes came a particular set of anxieties about celebration, propriety, and the proper management of traditional festivals. The Victorian era in America, roughly the 1870s through the early 1900s, was characterized by a fascinating contradiction. A deep appreciation for sentiment and tradition combined with an equally deep concern about excess, vulgarity, and social disorder. All Hallows Eve, as it existed in the late 19th century, presented Victorian sensibilities with a problem. The festival had energy, appeal, and growing popularity. But it also carried elements that respectable society found troubling: rowdy gatherings, fortune-telling that resembled superstition, costumes that could be grotesque or frightening, and the general atmosphere of misrule that accompanied the night. The Victorian solution applied to Halloween as it was to so many other aspects of life was domestication. Take the unruly festival, remove its rougher edges, emphasize its quaint traditional elements, and transform it into something suitable for parlor entertainment. Make it respectable, controllable, and profitable, because the Victorian age was nothing if not commercial. Women's magazines led this transformation, publishing elaborate guides for hosting Halloween parties that bore little resemblance to the Irish and Scottish celebrations of previous decades. These were not community gatherings around bonfires, not nights for wandering between houses in costume, not occasions for serious divination or supernatural observation. These were carefully orchestrated social events, held in homes, governed by strict rules of propriety, designed to provide entertainment within acceptable bounds. The magazines offered detailed instructions: how to decorate one's home with autumn leaves and corn stalks, how to arrange lighting for appropriately eerie but not frightening atmosphere, how to organize games that referenced traditional practices while remaining suitable for mixed company. The goal was to capture Halloween's appeal, its slight sense of transgression, its association with the supernatural, its seasonal charm, while eliminating anything that might cause actual discomfort or challenge social norms. Fortune-telling was permitted, but transformed. The serious divination practices of Irish and Scottish tradition, the attempts to genuinely glimpse the future or communicate with the supernatural, became parlor games. Young people still engaged in activities meant to reveal their romantic futures, but now these were explicitly recognized as entertainment rather than actual prophecy. The apple peeling was still thrown over the shoulder to reveal initials, but with knowing smiles rather than genuine belief. The mirror rituals were performed, but with the understanding that they were playing at superstition, engaging in a kind of theatrical mysticism. This represented a significant shift in the festival's character. For centuries, the boundary between entertainment and genuine supernatural engagement had been deliberately ambiguous. The ancient Celts and medieval Christians had approached these practices with real belief, real hope or fear about the results. Even the Irish and Scottish immigrants of the early 19th century had maintained some level of genuine investment in the divination rituals. But Victorian America wanted the appearance of the supernatural without the discomfort of actual believing in it. They wanted to feel the slight frisson of transgression without actual transgressing. They wanted Halloween to be exciting, but safe, mysterious, but ultimately under control. The decorations recommended by Victorian party guides were telling. Gone were the crude turnip lanterns designed to ward off evil spirits. In their place appeared elaborately carved pumpkins. Yes, but also paper decorations, harvest symbols, aestheticized versions of supernatural imagery. Witches appeared as decoration, but as charming silhouettes rather than genuine threats. Ghosts were represented, but as friendly white-sheeted figures rather than the potentially dangerous returning dead. Everything was made cute, or at least decorative. The supernatural was domesticated, rendered harmless through artistic representation. The Victorian approach to Halloween was to transform it into theatre, a performance of eeriness rather than a genuine engagement with the otherworldly. The games recommended for Victorian Halloween parties demonstrated this transformation perfectly. There was bobbing for apples, which had ancient origins in Roman and Celtic practice, but was now presented purely as entertainment, a messy but amusing activity for party guests. The romantic divination aspect was mentioned with a wink, acknowledged but not taken seriously. The magazines would explain the traditional meaning that the first to catch an apple would be the first to marry, and then encourage guests to laugh at the superstition while playing along. There were games involving blindfolds and fortune cookies, treasure hunts with supernatural themes, parlor charades focused on ghost stories. These activities referenced older traditions while stripping them of genuine supernatural belief. The Victorians were remarkably skilled at this kind of cultural taxidermy, preserving the outward form of a tradition while removing everything that had made it vital and dangerous. The costumes, too, underwent Victorian refinement. The frightening masks and animal skins of earlier traditions were replaced with more genteel options. Young ladies might dress as fortune-tellers or fairy tale characters, while young men might appear as ghosts, but friendly, non-threatening ghosts, the kind that floated rather than haunted. Children were encouraged to dress in costumes that were charming rather than frightening, representing harvest figures, storybook characters, or simplified supernatural beings. The Victorian era also saw the development of Halloween as a particularly romantic holiday focused on courtship and marriage prospects. This was not entirely new. The divination practices had always had romantic elements, but the Victorians elevated this aspect to central importance. Halloween parties became opportunities for young people to socialize under the guise of traditional celebration, for flirtation to occur within the protective framework of ancient custom. The romantic focus was particularly appealing to middle-class Victorian society, which was deeply anxious about proper courtship. Halloween provided a sanctioned occasion for young people to interact, to play games together, to engage in activities that were mildly daring, holding hands during games, laughing together at fortune-telling results, while remaining within the bounds of propriety. The supernatural theme provided a convenient excuse for behavior that might otherwise be considered too forward. Young women consulted mirrors at midnight, supposedly to see their future husbands, but really to participate in a romantic ritual that Victorian society deemed acceptable, because it was traditional. Young men participated in games that allowed them to demonstrate prowess or charm while maintaining the fiction that they were simply honoring old customs. The entire structure was brilliant in its way, using ancient tradition to create modern opportunities for romantic connection. The food served at Victorian Halloween parties became increasingly elaborate. The soul cakes of medieval tradition had largely disappeared, replaced by specifically American confections. Candied apples appeared, combining the Roman fruit with American candy-making techniques. Popcorn balls became popular, using the Native American corn in sweet preparations. Pumpkin pies, already associated with autumn, became specifically linked to Halloween. The refreshments served were meant to be both seasonal and slightly unusual, referencing harvest abundance while maintaining a vaguely supernatural theme. Cider was served, often spiced and heated, as a nod to autumn harvest. Nuts were still present, connecting to ancient traditions, but now roasted and served in decorative bowls rather than thrown into fires for divination. The Victorian Halloween party, as presented in magazines and actually practiced in middle-class homes, was a carefully constructed experience. It took elements from Celtic tradition, Irish and Scottish folk practice, medieval Christian observance, and American harvest festivals, then filtered all of it through Victorian sensibilities about proper celebration. What emerged was something genuinely new, an American holiday that referenced multiple traditions while belonging wholly to none of them. This domestication of Halloween was not universally welcomed or practiced. In immigrant communities, particularly Irish and Scottish neighbourhoods, older traditions persisted with less Victorian refinement. In rural areas, where middle-class propriety had less influence, the celebrations maintained more rowdy, traditional elements. Children still roamed in groups, still played pranks, still engaged in behaviour that Victorian ladies' magazines would certainly not have endorsed, and this created a tension that would shape Halloween's development into the 20th century. There were now effectively two Halloweens, the respectable, domesticated version promoted by middle-class Victorian culture, and the rougher, more traditional version practiced in working-class and immigrant communities. The genteel parlour parties coexisted with street celebrations, rowdy pranks, and practices that maintained closer connections to the festival's origins. The pranks, in particular, would become a significant issue. The tradition of mischief on Halloween night had deep roots. The medieval geysers had engaged in mild threats and tricks. The Celtic celebrations had included elements of misrule and reversal of normal social order. But in American cities of the late 19th century, with large populations of young people and limited social control, Halloween pranks could escalate into genuine vandalism. Outhouses were overturned. This was the classic Halloween prank, mentioned in countless period accounts. Gates were removed from their hinges, windows were soaped, wagons were disassembled and reassembled on rooftops. These pranks were understood as traditional, as expected parts of Halloween celebration, but they also represented real property damage and social disruption. The tension between Halloween's respectable and rowdy versions would intensify in the early 20th century, eventually requiring intervention and the invention of new traditions to manage the chaos. But in the Victorian era, the two versions coexisted, representing different class expressions of the same underlying festival. The Victorian period also saw the beginning of Halloween's commercialization. Greeting card companies began producing Halloween cards, decorated with images of jack-o'-lanterns, witches, black cats, and autumn scenes. These cards were meant to be sent to friends and romantic interests, carrying greetings and often including romantic or humorous verse. The Halloween greeting card would never achieve the commercial importance of Christmas or Valentine's Day cards, but their existence marked Halloween's entry into consumer culture. Manufacturers began producing specific Halloween decorations: paper cutouts, cardboard figures, crepe paper in orange and black. The color scheme of orange and black became standardized during this period, combining the orange of pumpkins and autumn leaves with the black of night and the supernatural. This color combination would become so firmly associated with Halloween that it remains unchanged over a century later. The Victorian transformation of Halloween represented something that humans have done repeatedly throughout history. Take a festival with ancient, complex origins and reshape it to serve contemporary needs. The Victorians needed a fall celebration that was romantic but proper, exciting but controlled, traditional but suitable for modern middle-class life. They found it, or created it, in Halloween. The process required considerable violence to the holiday's previous forms. The genuine supernatural belief was eliminated or reduced to play acting. The community-wide celebrations were privatized into individual parties. The religious elements, both pagan and Christian, were largely removed or reduced to aesthetic references. What had been a festival marking the boundary between life and death, honoring ancestors, and acknowledging genuine fear of the dark, became a parlor entertainment focused on romantic fortune-telling and seasonal charm. And yet, something of the original persisted. Even in the most refined Victorian Halloween party, even among guests who would never admit to genuine superstition, there remained a sense that October 31st was different. That the boundary between worlds was thinner, even if one did not quite believe in other worlds. That the dead were closer, even if one acknowledged this only through decorations and games. That darkness held power, even if that power was carefully managed through proper lighting and scheduled entertainment. The human instinct to find beauty in fear, to create meaning from seasonal change, to gather together when darkness threatened. These could not be entirely domesticated, no matter how many ladies' magazines published party planning guides. The Victorians had not eliminated Halloween's deeper currents. They had merely channeled them into socially acceptable forms. And those deeper currents, like water forced through narrow channels, would sometimes burst their constraints. The rowdy Halloween of immigrant neighborhoods and rural areas persisted alongside the genteel parties. Young people still found ways to push boundaries, to engage in pranks and mischief, to use Halloween's traditional license for misrule as an excuse for behavior they would not attempt any other night of the year. The delightful human instinct to turn anything vaguely spiritual into an excuse for costumes and gossip had found full expression in Victorian Halloween. The parties were opportunities for social display, for demonstrating one's knowledge of proper celebration, for creating memories and connections within one's social circle. The supernatural theme was decoration. The traditional practices were entertainment, but the real purpose was thoroughly social, bringing people together, facilitating interaction, creating shared experience. As the Victorian era gave way to the 20th century, Halloween stood at another threshold. It had been successfully Americanized, transformed from an ethnic tradition into a broadly popular celebration. It had been domesticated, made suitable for respectable society. It had entered commercial culture, becoming a marketable occasion for cards, decorations, and themed entertainment. But it had not yet become the massive cultural phenomenon it would become. That transformation would require new technologies, new media, and the intervention of a particularly powerful force in American culture: Hollywood. The movies were coming, and they would discover that nothing sold tickets quite like fear, properly packaged and projected onto a screen. The 20th century transformed Halloween from a regional celebration, unevenly practiced across America, into a national phenomenon, and eventually a global export. This transformation occurred through the convergence of multiple forces: mass media, commercial interests, deliberate community organizing, and the peculiar genius of American popular culture for taking traditions and making them bigger, louder, and more universally accessible. The first decades of the 20th century saw Halloween's rougher elements becoming increasingly problematic. The pranks that had been tolerated or even expected in earlier eras escalated in cities and towns across America. What had been mostly harmless mischief, overturned outhouses, soaped windows, was evolving into genuine vandalism. Property was being destroyed, fires were being set, violence was occurring with disturbing frequency. The period from roughly 1920 to 1940 saw Halloween develop a genuinely dangerous reputation. Newspapers reported extensive damage each November 1st. Communities struggled to manage the chaos. The night had become associated not with charming traditions or romantic divination, but with youth running wild, with property crime, with social disorder. This created a crisis, particularly for civic organizations and community leaders. Halloween had considerable cultural momentum. It was popular, widely celebrated, deeply embedded in American autumn tradition. But in its current form, it was becoming unsustainable, a genuine public safety concern. The solution that emerged was both simple and profound. Redirect the energies of young people into organized, supervised activities. Give them structured ways to celebrate Halloween that did not involve destruction. Create community events that would channel the holiday's appeal while eliminating its dangers. Civic organizations, schools, and parent groups began organizing Halloween parties and parades. These were not small affairs. Entire communities were mobilized to create celebrations that would be exciting enough to compete with the thrill of vandalism, elaborate enough to capture young people's imagination, and structured enough to prevent chaos. The Halloween parade became an American institution during this period, Towns would organize elaborate processions, with participants in costume marching through streets, judges awarding prizes for the best costumes, community members lining the routes to watch. The parades served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment, they showcased community creativity, they gave young people a sanctioned outlet for the exhibitionism and excitement that might otherwise manifest as pranks. The costume contest became central to these organized celebrations. Rather than simply wearing costumes as traditional practice, participants now competed for recognition, for prizes, for the admiration of their community. This competitive element added motivation and structure, transforming costume wearing from traditional observance into participatory performance. The costumes themselves began to change during this period. The homemade costumes of earlier eras, adapted from existing clothes, created from household materials, were supplemented by commercially produced options. Companies began manufacturing Halloween costumes, initially simple affairs, but increasingly elaborate as the market developed. The commercial costume industry would eventually become enormous, but in its early decades it served an important function in standardizing and expanding Halloween imagery. The witches, ghosts, and jack-o'-lanterns of earlier tradition were joined by an expanding cast of characters: vampires from literature, mummies from archaeological fascination, monsters from emerging popular culture. And here, Hollywood enters the story with decisive effect. The film industry of the 1920s and 1930s discovered that horror sold tickets. Universal Studios, in particular, became famous for its monster movies: Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Werewolf, The Invisible Man. These films created a new visual vocabulary for Halloween, a cast of characters that would become inseparable from the holiday. Bela Lugosi's Dracula, with his evening cape and aristocratic menace, became a Halloween costume almost immediately. Boris Karloff's Frankenstein's monster, with its distinctive flat-top head and neck bolts, entered Halloween iconography permanently. The wrapped mummy, the howling werewolf, the mad scientist, all of these emerged from Hollywood and were absorbed into Halloween celebration with remarkable speed. The relationship between Hollywood and Halloween was symbiotic. The movies provided imagery, characters, and inspiration for Halloween celebrations. Halloween, in turn, provided built-in marketing opportunities for horror films. Studios would time releases of scary movies for late October, capitalizing on the holiday's atmosphere. Theaters would host Halloween screenings, decorating lobbies with seasonal themes, encouraging audiences to attend in costume. This connection between Halloween and media-generated horror fundamentally changed the holiday's character. Where earlier celebrations had drawn on folk traditions, agricultural cycles, and genuine spiritual beliefs, 20th century Halloween increasingly referenced popular culture. Children dressed as movie monsters alongside traditional witches and ghosts. The supernatural beings that had once represented real fears or actual folk beliefs became characters, fictional entities from entertainment media. Nothing says sacred remembrance quite like mass-produced rubber masks, apparently. The profound connection between the living and the dead, the solemn acknowledgement of mortality, the spiritual significance of the threshold between seasons, All of this was being replaced by Boris Karloff's face rendered in cheap latex. And yet, something persisted. Even as Halloween became commercialized and media-saturated, even as its imagery became divorced from any genuine, supernatural belief, the holiday maintained its essential character. It remained a celebration of fear made safe, of darkness acknowledged but controlled, of boundaries transgressed within carefully managed contexts. The masks had changed, but the impulse behind them, to become something other than yourself, to play with identity and mortality, remained constant. The organized community celebrations successfully reduced Halloween vandalism. By providing structured activities, by channeling young people's energies into parades and parties, by making legitimate celebration more appealing than destructive pranks, communities managed to tame Halloween's dangerous elements without eliminating the holiday itself. But this success came with costs. The spontaneous, community-wide quality of earlier celebrations was lost. Halloween was becoming an organized event rather than an organic observance. The supervision required to prevent chaos also eliminated much of the traditional freedom and misrule that had characterized the night. The 1930s and 1940s also saw the emergence of trick or treat in its modern form. The phrase itself, combining the threat of a trick with the promise of treating, appeared in various forms across North America. The practice built on older traditions of going door to door in costume, of mumming and guising and souling, but simplified and standardized them. Children would arrive at doors in costume, say trick or treat, and receive candy or other treats. The trick was largely theoretical. Actual pranks became increasingly rare as the practice became established. But the implicit threat remained part of the formula, a vestigial reminder of Halloween's older, more dangerous character. The practice spread unevenly at first, becoming established in some communities while remaining unknown in others. World War II interrupted its development, as sugar rationing made treats difficult to provide and community attention focused elsewhere. But after the war, trick-or-treating exploded across America, becoming within a single decade the defining Halloween activity for children. Several factors drove this rapid adoption. The post-war suburban boom created neighborhoods ideal for trick-or-treating. Safe streets, houses close enough together to make walking practical, communities of families with children. The baby boom provided enormous numbers of potential trick-or-treaters, and parents looking for wholesome activities for their children embraced a practice that seemed innocent, traditional, and controllable. Candy companies, naturally, supported trick-or-treating with considerable enthusiasm. Here was a holiday custom that required their product, that occurred at a specific date, allowing for targeted marketing, that involved children who would pester their parents to purchase candy in preparation for the anticipated hordes of costumed visitors. Halloween rapidly became the second highest candy sales period of the year, trailing only Christmas. The commercialization of Halloween accelerated dramatically in the post-war period. What had been a modest market for greeting cards and simple decorations exploded into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Manufacturers produced everything imaginable with Halloween themes, costumes, decorations, party supplies, specialized candy packaging, even Halloween-themed housewares and clothing. The imagery became increasingly standardized during this period. Orange and black remained the dominant colors. Jack-o'-lanterns, witches, black cats, bats, ghosts, and skeletons became the visual vocabulary of Halloween, reproduced endlessly on products ranging from paper napkins to lawn decorations. The symbols had lost most of their original meanings. Few people carving pumpkins thought about Stingy Jack, fewer still about warding off evil spirits, but they persisted as aesthetic markers of the season. Television contributed enormously to Halloween's nationalization and standardization. Special Halloween episodes of popular programs became annual traditions, introducing Halloween themes and practices to audiences across the country. Children who might not have encountered trick-or-treating in their own communities saw it portrayed on television and demanded to participate. Regional variations in celebration were gradually eroded as television presented a unified vision of how Halloween should be observed. The Disney Company, with its genius for appropriating and sanitizing folklore, produced Halloween content that further domesticated the holiday. Friendly witches, comical ghosts, and non-threatening supernatural beings became standard Halloween imagery for children. The genuinely frightening was reserved for older audiences, while children's Halloween became almost aggressively cheerful, scary in the same way that a cardboard skeleton is scary, superficially spooky but fundamentally harmless. Horror films continued to evolve alongside Halloween, each influencing the other. The 1960s and 1970s saw increasingly sophisticated and genuinely frightening horror cinema. Films like Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and eventually Halloween itself, John Carpenter's 1978 slasher film that deliberately set its action on October 31st, created new associations between the holiday and cinematic terror. The slasher film genre, which emerged in the late 1970s and dominated 1980s horror, became particularly associated with Halloween. These films often featured masked killers, teenage victims, and October 31st settings. They were not suitable for children, certainly, but they influenced Halloween's imagery and atmosphere for adult celebrations. The holiday bifurcated into children's trick-or-treating and adult costume parties, each with its own character and rules. Adult Halloween celebrations in the latter 20th century became increasingly elaborate. Costume parties grew more ambitious, with participants spending considerable time and money on elaborate outfits. The costumes themselves expanded beyond traditional Halloween imagery to include any cultural reference, any pop culture character, any concept that could be rendered visually. Halloween became an occasion for creativity, humor, and social display. The sexy costume phenomenon emerged during this period, transforming Halloween into an occasion when adults, particularly women, could dress in ways that would be socially unacceptable any other time of year. The sexy witch, sexy nurse, sexy cat. Virtually any costume concept acquired a sexy variation. This development had only the most tenuous connection to Halloween's origins, but it tapped into the holiday's traditional association with transgression, with the suspension of normal rules. Universities and urban neighborhoods developed Halloween celebrations that were essentially massive street parties, drawing thousands of participants. Greenwich Village in New York, West Hollywood in Los Angeles, and similar areas became famous for their Halloween celebrations, elaborate costume displays, impromptu performances, communal revelry that echoed, however distantly, the community-wide gatherings of ancient Samhain. Meanwhile, suburban trick-or-treating became increasingly regulated and supervised. Concerns about safety, some legitimate, some driven by media-amplified fears, led to rules about acceptable trick-or-treating hours, age limits for participants, and extensive parental supervision. The practice that had emerged as a relatively free-form activity became highly structured, with defined routes, specific time windows, and adult oversight. Haunted houses emerged as a distinctly American Halloween tradition. These could range from simple home-based efforts, decorated garages or basements designed to frighten neighborhood children, to elaborate commercial operations. The commercial haunted house industry grew into a significant business, with professional designers creating increasingly sophisticated, scary experiences. These attractions served an interesting purpose, providing controlled fear, allowing participants to experience terror with the safety of knowing it was all performance. The commercial haunted house represented, in many ways, the ultimate expression of modern Halloween. Fear as entertainment, horror as consumer product, the supernatural reduced to special effects and theatrical performance. The ancient Celts had genuinely feared the night of Samhain, believing that actual spirits walked among them. Modern Americans paid admission to be scared by teenagers in costume inside a converted warehouse. And yet, the basic human impulse remained recognizable. People still sought the experience of fear, still wanted to confront darkness and mortality in controlled circumstances, still found something valuable in the thrill of being frightened. The context had changed entirely, but the underlying need persisted. Theme parks began hosting Halloween events, transforming themselves for the season into elaborately decorated horror attractions. Disneyland's Halloween celebrations, Universal Studios' Halloween Horror Nights, and similar events became major revenue generators, drawing visitors specifically for seasonal scares. The parks combined their existing entertainment infrastructure with Halloween themes, creating experiences that were simultaneously nostalgic and cutting-edge, family-friendly and genuinely frightening, depending on which attractions visitors chose. The holiday spread beyond its traditional home territories during this period. Regions of the United States that had not historically celebrated Halloween, parts of the South, some rural areas, adopted the practice as trick-or-treating, and Halloween parties became standardized through media influence. By the late 20th century, Halloween had become truly national in scope, celebrated in some form across virtually all American communities. More significantly, Halloween began to spread internationally. American cultural influence, transmitted through movies, television, and commercial interests, carried Halloween to countries with no historical connection to Samhain or All Hallows' Eve. Japan began celebrating Halloween in the 1990s, initially in theme parks and expatriate communities, but eventually developing its own distinctive approach focused on costume parades and parties. Europe, which had largely abandoned its own Halloween-related traditions, saw the American version return as a commercial import, complete with trick-or-treating, jack-o'-lanterns, and costume parties. This international spread was controversial. Cultural critics saw it as American cultural imperialism, the displacement of local traditions by commercialized American practices. The Catholic Church in various countries objected to the secular, commercial Halloween overshadowing All Saints' Day. Some countries resisted, viewing Halloween as foreign corruption of their culture. But others embraced it enthusiastically, finding in Halloween something their own cultures lacked: a light-hearted celebration in late autumn, an occasion for costumes and parties, a festival that was fun without requiring the emotional or religious weight of more significant holidays. The appeal was universal, even if the specific form was American. People everywhere enjoy dressing up, eating treats, and playing with fear. By the end of the 20th century, Halloween had achieved a remarkable position in global culture. It was simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and commercial, meaningful and empty. It connected back through centuries to Celtic Samhain and medieval All Hallows' Eve. But it was also thoroughly contemporary, shaped by movies, television, consumer culture, and social media. The festival's imagery was globally recognizable. The jack-o'-lantern required no cultural translation. Its practices were simple enough to adopt anywhere. Costumes, candy, spooky decorations transcended linguistic and cultural barriers. And its emotional core, the pleasure of controlled fear, the joy of transformation through costume, the communal celebration of autumn's darkness, proved universally appealing. The festival that had begun as a Celtic New Year, that had survived Roman conquest and Christian conversion, that had traveled to America in the memories of immigrants, that had been domesticated by Victorians and commercialized by modern capitalism, was now global. Children in Tokyo dressed as witches. Teenagers in Dublin celebrated an American-style Halloween that bore little resemblance to the Irish traditions their ancestors had practiced. Adults in London attended Halloween parties that would have been utterly foreign to the medieval Londoners who once observed All Hallows' Eve with solemn church services. The irony was not lost on cultural observers. Halloween had returned to its geographical origins, but transformed, Americanized, stripped of its religious and folkloric meanings, and rebuilt as entertainment and commercial opportunity. The night that had once marked the Celtic New Year, that had been about genuine communion with the dead and survival through winter's darkness, was now about candy sales and costume contests. And yet, beneath all the commercial excess and cultural transformation, something of the original persisted. People still gathered on October 31st. They still marked the transition into winter's darkness. They still engaged with themes of death and the supernatural, even if that engagement now took the form of watching horror movies rather than leaving offerings for spirits. They still transformed themselves through costume, still created light against the darkness with their jack-o'-lanterns, still found ways to celebrate community at the moment when isolation threatened. The festival had survived by changing, by absorbing new influences, by proving flexible enough to serve the needs of each culture and era it encountered. From Samhain to All Hallows' Eve to Halloween, from sacred fire to soul cakes to candy corn, from druids to bishops to Disney, the night had endured. The worldwide spread of Halloween in the late 20th and early 21st centuries represented the latest chapter in this long story of transformation and survival. It was proof that humans everywhere share certain needs for festival and celebration, for engaging with fear and darkness, for marking seasonal transitions, for gathering together when the year dies and winter begins. Halloween had become the worldwide night, celebrated from its Celtic origins to modern Tokyo, from medieval churches to suburban cul-de-sacs, from ancient bonfires to LED-lit plastic decorations. The specific forms had changed beyond recognition, but the impulse behind them remained constant. When darkness comes, we light fires, gather together, and insist that we are not afraid, or at least that we will face our fear in costume, surrounded by friends, armed with candy. The festival's success, its survival across millennia, its spread across continents, testified to something fundamental about human nature. We need festivals that acknowledge death without being consumed by it, that engage with fear without being paralyzed, that mark time's passage while celebrating our persistence through that passage. We need nights that are different from other nights, when normal rules are suspended and alternative possibilities emerge. Halloween, in all its contemporary commercial excess and cultural confusion, still provided this. It was no longer about the veil between worlds growing thin, at least not in any literal sense most celebrants believed, but it was still about boundaries, between summer and winter, childhood and adulthood, safety and fear, the mundane and the extraordinary. And it still invited us to dance along those boundaries, to cross them temporarily, to return safely with stories to tell. The ancient Celts would perhaps not recognize the holiday that bore their festival's spiritual descendant. The medieval Christians would be baffled by trick-or-treating. The 19th century Irish immigrants would be astonished by the commercial scale. But they might all recognize, beneath the unfamiliar surface, the essential impulse to make meaning from darkness, to find beauty in fear, to gather together when the world grows cold and the nights grow long. And they might appreciate, with whatever sense of humor the dead possess, that humanity still celebrated the night they had marked as sacred, still lit fires against the darkness, even if those fires were now candles in plastic pumpkins purchased at discount stores. The festival had traveled far from its origins, but it had arrived at something like its destination, a worldwide celebration that belonged to everyone and no one, that carried ancient meanings and contemporary purposes, that was simultaneously completely commercialized and still, somehow, genuinely about the things that matter: community, transformation, the acknowledgement of mortality, and the stubborn human insistence on celebrating even in the face of winter's approach. We have traveled, you and I, across 3,000 years of autumn nights, from the bonfires of prehistoric Europe to the LED-lit subdivisions of the 21st century, from Druid ceremonies to Disney decorations, from genuine terror of the dark to controlled scares in commercial haunted houses. The journey has been long, the transformations profound, and the ironies abundant. But here, at the end of the story, it is worth considering what has actually changed and what has remained constant through all these centuries of evolution. The surface certainly has transformed beyond recognition. The ancient Celt lighting a Samhain bonfire would find nothing familiar in modern Halloween. The vegetables are different, the theology is absent, The genuine belief in wandering spirits has been replaced by rubber masks and artificial fog machines. The medieval Christian attending All Hallows' Eve services would be horrified by the secular costume party, the complete absence of prayer, the transformation of a holy night into commercial spectacle. The Victorian hostess, carefully orchestrating her parlour party according to magazine instructions, would be bewildered by trick-or-treating children demanding candy from strangers. The Irish immigrant, carrying memories of Samhain celebrations across the Atlantic, would struggle to recognize their tradition in the contemporary mega-holiday, with its billion-dollar commercial infrastructure and global reach. And yet, underneath all this transformation, certain patterns persist with remarkable consistency. We still gather on October 31st, despite all the changes in how we live, despite the fact that most of us are no longer farmers, dreading winter's approach, despite electric lights that eliminate the darkness and central heating that defeats the cold, we still mark this specific night as different, as special, as worthy of celebration. We still engage with themes of death and the supernatural, even if we no longer believe in them literally. The ghosts and witches and monsters that decorate our homes, that inspire our costumes, that populate our entertainment. These are descendants, however distant, of the spirits our ancestors genuinely feared. We have domesticated them, made them cute or transformed them into entertainment, but we have not eliminated them. We still acknowledge, through these symbols, that death exists, that the world contains forces beyond our understanding, that darkness has power even if we control it with light switches. We still transform ourselves through costume, just as the ancient Celts did when they disguised themselves to confuse the spirits. Our reasons may differ: entertainment rather than protection, self-expression rather than survival. But the practice persists. On October 31st, we grant ourselves permission to become something other than what we are, to try on alternative identities, to play with boundaries between self and other. We still create light against the darkness. The carved pumpkins glowing on porches serve the same symbolic function as the ancient Samhain bonfires or the medieval turnip lanterns. They mark the boundary between inside and outside, safety and danger, human space and the wild night beyond. They are declarations of intent. Here we stand, in the darkness, refusing to be consumed by it. We still share food and treats, though the theological justification has long since vanished. Trick-or-treating children receive candy rather than soul cakes, and no one truly believes these treats will release souls from purgatory. But the transaction remains, the community feeding its young, the acknowledgement of obligation between households, the sharing of abundance before scarcity arrives. We still tell ghost stories, though now we watch them on screens rather than speak them around fires. The medium has changed, but the practice endures, gathering together to share tales of the supernatural, to frighten each other safely, to acknowledge death while celebrating our continued life. We still mark the transition from summer's abundance to winter's scarcity, even though most of us no longer depend on harvest success for survival. The autumn decorations, the harvest themes, the pumpkins and corn stalks, and autumn leaves, all of this acknowledges seasonal change, marks this moment as significant in the year's progression. And we still gather in community, however that community is defined. Whether it is children trick-or-treating through neighborhoods, adults attending costume parties, families watching Halloween movies together, or strangers celebrating in city streets, the night brings people together. In an age of increasing isolation, of digital connection replacing physical presence, Halloween persists as an occasion that requires actual gathering, actual physical community. These continuities suggest something important about the festival and about human nature. We change the forms of our celebrations constantly, adapting them to new circumstances, new beliefs, new technologies. But underneath the changing forms, certain needs remain constant. We need festivals that mark time's passage. We need occasions that acknowledge death without being overwhelmed by it. We need permission to transform, to play, to transgress normal boundaries within safe contexts. We need communal celebrations that bring us together when isolation threatens. Halloween has survived 3,000 years because it serves these needs, and it has served them flexibly enough to adapt to radically different circumstances. It survived the transition from paganism to Christianity by changing its name and official purpose while maintaining its essential structure. It survived the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the rise of rationalism by becoming progressively less literal, less supernatural, more entertainment-focused, but without losing its connection to themes of death and the otherworldly. It survived immigration to America by transforming its specific practices while maintaining its general character. It survived the Victorian era's domestication by splitting into multiple versions, respectable and rowdy, commercial and traditional, adult and child-focused, each serving different needs. It survived the 20th century's commercialization by embracing it, by becoming so thoroughly integrated into consumer culture that its continued celebration was economically incentivized. And it is surviving the 21st century by going global, by proving that its appeal transcends its specific cultural origins, that people everywhere respond to its combination of playfulness and darkness, treat-giving and transformation, community celebration and individual expression. The festival's very emptiness, its lack of fixed theological meaning, its flexibility about who can celebrate and how, has paradoxically enabled its survival. A festival with rigid requirements, with specific doctrinal commitments, with elaborate traditional practices that must be performed precisely, would have died as those requirements became impossible to meet or those beliefs became untenable. But Halloween has proven willing to be almost anything: pagan ceremony, Christian observance, immigrant tradition, Victorian parlor entertainment, children's treat gathering, adult costume party, commercial extravaganza, global phenomenon. This flexibility is Halloween's genius and, some would argue, its emptiness. The festival no longer means anything specific, critics contend. It is pure surface, pure consumerism, pure entertainment without substance. The ancient connection to actual seasonal transitions has been lost for most celebrants. The religious meanings, both pagan and Christian, have been forgotten. The folk practices have been reduced to aesthetic references. What remains is candy sales and costume contests, nothing more. And yet meaning persists, even if it is different from the original meanings. For children, Halloween remains magical, a night when they can become superheroes or princesses or monsters, when adults give them candy simply for appearing at doors, when the normal rules are suspended and adventure is possible. This may not be the same meaning as Samhain held for the ancient Celts, but it is genuine meaning nonetheless. For adults, Halloween provides permission for playfulness and creativity, for trying on alternative identities, for gathering with friends in celebration rather than obligation. It offers controlled engagement with fear through horror movies and haunted houses, allowing us to experience and process anxiety in safe contexts. It marks autumn's progress, creates shared cultural moments, provides stories and memories. For communities, Halloween remains an occasion for gathering, for crossing boundaries between households, for creating shared experience. The children moving through neighborhoods on October 31st, the parents accompanying them, the families answering doors to distribute candy. All of this creates social connection, builds community bonds, reminds us that we live among others and share obligations to them. These meanings may seem trivial compared to the ancient belief that the dead walked among the living, that the year itself died and was reborn, that survival through winter hung in the balance. But they are the meanings available to us, the ways we can mark this night as significant given who we are and how we live. They are what Halloween has become, for better or worse, in an age that no longer fears the darkness because we can eliminate it with electricity, no longer depends on harvest success because we import food from across the globe, no longer believes literally in wandering spirits because we have different frameworks for understanding death. The festival has survived by becoming less serious, less literal, less threatening. And perhaps this is the only way it could have survived. A night that genuinely terrified people, that required actual belief in supernatural dangers, would not persist in an age of rationalism and scientific explanation. But a night that plays with these themes, that allows us to engage with fear and death and the supernatural as entertainment and symbolism rather than literal truth, that can endure. Beneath all the masks, the rubber ones purchased at costume shops and the metaphorical ones we wear daily, Halloween still carries what it has always carried: the human need to mark time's passage, to acknowledge death's presence, to gather together when darkness comes, and to insist, through celebration and defiance and sheer stubborn persistence, that we will survive. That winter will not defeat us, that death, though inevitable, has not yet arrived, that we can find beauty and meaning and even joy in the darkness if we face it together, in costume, with candy. The ancient fires have become candles in jack-o'-lanterns. The sacred ceremonies have become costume parties. The genuine terror has become entertainment. The soul cakes have become candy corn. But the gathering persists. The lighting of fires against the darkness continues, and the human community still comes together on October 31st to celebrate the night. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the survival of the form, however transformed, matters more than the preservation of the original meaning. Perhaps the fact that we still mark this night, still find it worthy of celebration, still create light and gather together and acknowledge the season's change. Perhaps this continuity is itself meaningful, regardless of how much the specific practices have changed. The Celts lit their Samhain fires to survive winter and honor the dead. We carve our jack-o'-lanterns for entirely different reasons, but in both cases we are creating light against the darkness, marking a boundary between safe and dangerous, human and other, life and death. The intention has changed, but the impulse remains recognizable across 3,000 years. And on October 31st, when the jack-o'-lanterns glow on porches and children move through darkness in costumes and communities gather to celebrate, we are connected, however tenuously, however unconsciously, to every generation that has marked this night as special. To the Celts gathering around their sacred bonfires, to the medieval Christians praying for souls in purgatory, to the Irish immigrants carving turnips in memory of home, to the Victorian hosts creating parlour entertainments, to all who have stood at this threshold time and insisted, through ritual and celebration and sheer determined festivity, that the darkness would not win. The festival has travelled far, changed profoundly, survived everything thrown at it. And it persists because we still need what it offers, a night that is different from other nights, when transformation is possible, when fear can be faced safely, when community gathers, when the darkness is acknowledged but not feared, when we celebrate our persistence through time and season and all the changes they bring. Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. We have explored the story of Halloween, from ancient Samhain to modern trick-or-treating, from Druid ceremonies to Disney decorations, from genuine supernatural belief to commercial spectacle. The journey has shown us that humans are remarkably good at preserving what matters to us by constantly changing how we express it, that festivals survive by transforming, and that underneath all the costumes and candy and commercial excess, the ancient impulse persists, to gather together when darkness comes, to light fires against the night, and to celebrate our continued presence in a world that constantly reminds us of our mortality. The jack-o'-lanterns still glow 3,000 years later. The fires still burn, even if they are now candles rather than bonfires. And we still gather on October 31st, still mark the night as different, still celebrate the boundary between light and darkness, life and death, the known and the mysterious. The festival endures, and so, for one more year, do we? Sweet dreams.